This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's National HoUSed campaign call. We're going to give it a minute or so for folks to join on the line, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, well, welcome everybody to our National HoUSed campaign call. We're going to give it a little bit of time for folks to join on the line, but in the meantime, I just want to remind folks that our National HoUSed campaign is focused on achieving the large-scale and sustained investments and anti-racist reforms that we need to ensure that all renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. We launched this campaign in 2021 because we recognize that more than ever, we need to have bold policies to ensure that people with the lowest incomes and those who are most marginalized have a stable, affordable home. On our call today, we have advocates from across the country, including homeless shelter and service providers, housing advocates, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including low-income individuals who are in need of or receiving federal housing assistance. We have people who are experiencing homelessness, philanthropy, and media on the line. Before we jump into today's agenda, I just want to remind folks that you can ask questions in the Q&A box. That's a little bit easier for us to follow than in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during today's call. And as a reminder, we're going to send everybody a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, as well as any of the materials that our speakers mentioned in the coming days. So I'm going to start off with an overview of the President's FY24 budget request, which just came out. But before I do that, I just want to remind folks that now is the time for you to register for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's annual forum. I think we are at capacity when it comes to in-person attendance, but there's plenty of room for folks to join online if you want to attend virtually. We have a really amazing lineup of speakers, so I hope that you can make it. Just some of the most notable names I want to mention are Pulitzer Prize-winning author Matt Desmond will be there, who's going to be launching his new book. Reverend Dr. William Barber II will be there, HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge, FHFA Director Sandra Thompson, Treasury Deputy Secretary Wally Adeyemo, Representative Maxine Waters, who is the ranking member on the House Financial Services Committee, Representative Pramila Jayapal, who's the head of the Progressive Caucus, and many, many more. It's going to be a great event. I hope you guys can make it. So let's dig into the president's budget. Last Thursday, President Biden and HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge released their FY24 budget request. More details came out today as well. Overall, the proposal calls for increasing funding for affordable housing, and they use two major approaches. One is they provide or call for modest increases in funding to HUD's programs through the annual appropriations process, but they also call for major housing investments through mandatory spending. I'm going to start with the mandatory spending part because I think that's really helpful for us to know what this means, I guess. It's really important in the sense that this shows the public where the White House thinks we need to go in terms of the level of investments that are needed to address the housing crisis. But it's really important for advocates to know that this mandatory spending proposal is not going to get the bipartisan support that it needs to be enacted in this Congress. So it's a really good way of shadowing or projecting what the White House thinks is needed. But you should know that it's not really going to move anywhere in this Congress right now. So the president's mandatory spending proposal includes major housing investments. Much of it is targeted to extremely low-income households. So, for example, it calls for $3 billion to continue the emergency rental assistance program and eviction prevention programs that have been stood up during the pandemic. It calls for expanding rental assistance What's interesting here is they call for a $9 billion universal coverage of rental assistance for youth aging out of the foster care system, and $13 billion to serve extremely low-income veterans who are experiencing homelessness. And while it's very important and we're glad to see proposals that call for universal rental assistance for these populations, all of us in this room are going to be continuing to advocate for universal housing vouchers for everybody who's in need and not just those specific populations. The other thing that's worthwhile to mention is there's a lot of resources in the president's mandatory spending request that address capital needs and housing supply needs. There's about $7.5 billion for public housing, for the most distressed public housing developments. They call for expanding the low-income housing tax credit and expanding project-based rental assistance, about $7.5 billion, to help make sure that those units are affordable to extremely low-income renters. But now I'm going to turn the page. I want to talk about the regular appropriations proposal from the White House, because I think that's going to be much more relevant to the work that we're doing in the months ahead around the spending levels. So the president's budget calls for a modest increase in funding for HUD programs. He calls for $73.3 billion, which is about a 1.6% increase from last year. What's notable here is that for the most part, you see, like I said, modest increases to most programs. Some programs got level funding. I think most importantly, we were looking at the Housing Choice Voucher Program, for example, where they call for 50,000 new vouchers to expand rental assistance to more households. They do that through calling for increased funding, but they also have a proposal in there to allow for 130,000 additional households to get rental assistance, although they say that that's available through program reserves. We haven't seen enough of the details to really know, but that would mean about 180,000 more households would get rental assistance through the president's budget request. Again, we also see modest increases to homelessness and to housing supply. So for example, the Homeless Assistance Grants Program would receive $116 million more than last year, putting it at about $3.7 billion. Funding for public housing would be increased up to about $3.7 billion. And the Home Investment Partnership Program would receive another $300 million, bumping it up to about $1.8 billion overall. I'm going to ask my colleagues if they can share our updated budget chart in the chat box, so you can take a look at that and get more details. But what's really important here, most president's budgets are considered to be dead on arrival, and this president's budget is no different. It's a really important indicator of where we want to go, but Congress is going to do their own work. And so now that the president's request is out, the House and the Senate in the next couple of months are going to be working on their proposals and starting to draft their language. What's most concerning here is that this year, congressional Republicans are talking about making drastic cuts to the FY24 spending bill, including cuts to housing and homelessness programs. And they're saying that we have to cut those programs in exchange for either raising the debt ceiling or avoiding a government shutdown. If you're looking at how much Republicans want to cut, the numbers aren't entirely clear, but what we do know is that Speaker McCarthy has said that he wants to cap funding for FY24 levels for this year, cap it at FY22 levels. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is quite a bit of money. It's about $130 billion that would have to be cut from domestic programs. But depending on how you slice that, the impact could be much greater. So for example, if defense programs are exempted from those cuts, if the VA health programs are exempted from those cuts, you could see cuts to all other programs, including housing programs, by as much as 24%. Huge cuts. And some Republicans are going even further than that. There's been reports that they're considering a budget outline that would slash housing programs specifically by as much as 43%, and to eliminate the Section 8 program entirely, which is, as you know, a critical resource that provides millions of households with the assistance they need to afford rent and avoid eviction. I just want to let folks know that we are a long way away from seeing what a final budget looks like. And so I don't want anybody who's receiving Section 8 to feel worried just yet about what these cuts mean, because we're a long way from negotiation. But we should know that this is sort of the starting point of what Republicans are pushing for, and that we as advocates need to do everything we can to stop those budget cuts from happening. I think overall, our message to Congress is going to be that it's unacceptable to balance the federal budget by demanding cuts against the lowest income households, and that if we were to see cuts of this magnitude, we'd see even more people who are living precariously, only one paycheck away from housing instability, evictions, and homelessness. So there's a lot that you can do as advocates right now to push back on these Republican threats. One is to sign your organizations onto a national letter from the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding. This is the annual budget letter that they circulate every year, but it calls on Congress to reject any spending cuts to HUD programs and instead to provide the highest level of funding possible this year. You can also, and my colleagues will share a link to that in the chat box as well. You can also use our advocacy toolkit that includes talking points, sample media messages, a sample op-ed, other ways for you to get involved to push back on these budget cuts, to oppose them, and to make the case for as strong funding as possible. I know that when we're going to meet with congressional offices next week as part of our Capitol Hill Day, this is going to be top of center of mind for us. It's going to be the number one thing that advocates talk about with their members of Congress, but you don't have to wait for Hill Day to do that. You can start doing your advocacy now, and you should continue to do it into the future. I expect we're going to have a lot of these conversations leading up to June, July, August, which is when the federal government will default on its debt if Congress doesn't lift the debt ceiling. So with that, I'm going to pause to see if there's any questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box. I do see that there's questions about plans to strengthen the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Yes, there are bills that would do that. There's a bipartisan bill called the Choice and Affordable Housing Act that NLHC supports that would streamline the program, especially inspections. But like I said, our number one focus right now is stopping these budget cuts, and we can talk maybe on a future call about some opportunities to advance good legislation, though that will be really challenging this year with a divided Congress. Just gonna give me one more second to see if there's any other questions in the chat box. I just see one question asking to repeat what our ask will be for Congress next week. And I'll just say more information will be shared leading up to Hill Day, but our number one focus is going to be about pushing back on these budget cuts and the threats that we see here right now. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn to our next speaker. We're going to hear from Casey Dawkins, who is the professor of urban studies and planning at the University of Maryland. And they've done some great work looking at the connection between housing supply issues and homelessness. So Casey, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the Low Income Housing Coalition for inviting me to speak with you today, to this esteemed group. I was actually involved in homeless assistance programming back in the 90s. When I was in graduate school, I worked with the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, and we were the state agency administering the McKinney grants. And so I got sort of, as a grad student, got to learn all about the ins and outs of the homeless assistance grant program. So it was interesting, and I think very helpful to me to return to that with that context. This particular research was done as part of a sabbatical that I took at HUD last year. And I was involved in several different projects, but one of the major projects was looking at the relationship between housing supply and housing supply constraints and how that affected housing instability. So sort of two papers came out of that, one that focused on evictions, and then the one that I'll be talking about today, which focused on homelessness. The work is actually also published in the Journal of Urban Affairs at the link provided there. I'm happy to provide a copy of the paper if you're also interested. So thank you. So the literature on this topic, sort of the research on it is it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of work that looks at the relationship between rents and homelessness, sort of as housing prices, as rents go up, homelessness also goes up. And a book actually published last year with the title "Homelessness is a Housing Problem," I think has sort of drawn attention to that point. But less work has been done on the relationship between land use supply constraints or even geographic constraints on developable land and how that in turn also contributes to homelessness. There's actually one study that I've been able to find that actually looked at this connection. It was a paper in 2010 by Stephen Raphael. And essentially his argument is sort of a variation of what I just suggested, is that, there's a lot of literature that shows that as housing supply is constrained by restrictive land use regulations, regulations that limit the supply of land for housing, that has been shown time and time again to increase housing prices and rents. And then through that increase, that also reduces the housing that's available for those who are seeking new housing, and it also increases evictions for people who get priced out of their existing homes. So that's sort of an indirect channel of causality. And that's what I call in this diagram the rent effect. This light lines, the argument being that land use restrictions lead to increases in rent, and that is what drives homelessness. And so what I wanted to do in this paper is to ask sort of a different question. Is there actually a direct effect? Is it the case that land use restrictions directly contribute to homelessness? And one of the things that I was interested in looking at is sort of the hypothesis that I was working with was that landlords sort of anticipating restrictions on housing supply gives them sort of market power in those markets to raise rents. But anticipating those future increases in rents, what they may do, rather than immediately increase rents, the immediate response may actually be to evict tenants or to replace tenants, to sort of vacate buildings so that those buildings can be upgraded, can be converted to condos, can be upgraded to higher valued rental buildings, or even demolished for luxury housing. So the short-term effect may not be on rents. It may actually be that people get kicked out of their housing in the short term, and that sort of focusing on this rent effect misses an important direct connection. So that's sort of the second channel that I really wanted to look at in this paper, is what I call the eviction effect. And I actually I've mentioned this separate paper that looks at that more specifically, and did find that there's a relationship between land use restrictions and evictions. Well, this sort of looks at it through the lens of homelessness. So that's sort of the second channel that I'm looking at. The third is a sort of an indirect sort of backdoor effect. And the idea here is that local political preferences for restrictive land use regimes may be also associated with preferences for other kinds of restrictions, particularly those that affect homelessness. So it may be the case that places that restrict housing supply also are more likely to adopt homeless criminalization ordinances, maybe spending less on homeless assistance. And so it's that sort of backdoor channel that may contribute to homelessness. So those are the sort of linkages that I'm looking at. The approach that I've taken is a statistical model, and I'm using data that a lot of you are probably very familiar with. It's the continuum of care annual homeless point in time counts that are required to be submitted to HUD every year. And I use the HUD compilation of those across 5 time periods for 315 COCs in the US. So about 1,500 total observations across time and space. And so what I'm doing is estimating a statistical model that relates homeless rates, and I'm defining that as the rate of adult homelessness, as a function of various things that cause homelessness or that have been shown to be associated with homelessness, along with various housing supply indicators. And so the control variables are things like household demographic conditions, various forms of public assistance, climactic conditions, the severity of weather, and then various housing market conditions, including gross rents and other sort of housing supply characteristics. And so the question is, controlling for these other factors, what is the impact, the direct impact of land use restrictions and other supply constraints on homelessness? Okay, next slide. So I'm going to show you several graphics here. And in this first set of graphics, these are I'm sort of summarizing the main findings for 3 models that are explaining adult homelessness rates. So it's defined as the number of homeless adults per 10,000 adults in the community. And I showed both the housing supply indicators and I showed a few other indicators just to sort of put those into context. So in each of these slides, I'm showing a variable that's measured as the housing change or housing construction relative to employment change. So as you're constructing more housing, that means your supply is increasing. And also have a measure of gross rents, median gross rents. Those are the bottom 2 in each one. And so the way to read these, if the bar is going to the right, it's associated with a percentage increase in homelessness. If it's going left, it's associated with a percentage reduction. And this is the percent change in homelessness associated with a standard deviation change in each of these variables. And sort of focusing on the top variables in each of these models, model 1 suggests that as housing supply is more elastic, homelessness is statistically significantly lower than it would be otherwise. And specifically, a increase in housing supply elasticity is associated with about a 9% reduction in homelessness. Housing supply elasticity here is just defined as the responsiveness of housing supply to demand shocks. So how rapidly can housing producers add new housing in response to a demand shock? The second model sort of confirms the hypothesis that there is a positive association between restrictive land use regulations and housing or in homelessness. Here I'm using an index of regulatory restrictiveness developed by the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, sometimes called the Wharton Index. As this index becomes more positive, the restrictions are greater. So as the restrictiveness increases, adult homelessness increases by about 10%. In the third model, if there's an urban growth boundary in the metropolitan area, that's associated with about a 12% increase in homelessness. Notice also in each of these slides that as the availability of land is less, or as the unavailable land increases, there's a rise in homelessness. So more supply constrained places that have less buildable land are associated with more homelessness or more adult homelessness. Next slide. Can you go to the next slide, please? There we go. So what I did next is to look to see, okay, how do these results differ by sheltered versus unsheltered homelessness? It may be the case that there's sort of different drivers of homelessness for each of these different kinds of conditions. Turned out to be the case. It also turns out that housing supply indicators affected sheltered and unsheltered differently. So these slides show the percent change in adult sheltered homelessness. Again, housing supply elasticity is associated with a reduction in sheltered homelessness. Interesting, in all 3 of these slides, median gross rent is not a factor. It doesn't have an impact on sheltered homelessness. those who were living in temporary shelters or in transitional shelters. But the housing supply conditions, or most of them actually, are associated with homelessness. The regulatory index, again, positively related to homelessness. As this index increases, adult homelessness or sheltered homelessness increases by about 12%. Again, unavailable land is associated with a rise in homelessness. The presence of an urban growth boundary, however, has no relationship to sheltered homelessness. Next slide, please. And then the final set of models looks at unsheltered homelessness. And here, rents have a big impact. As median gross rent increases, it's associated with a dramatic increase in unsheltered homelessness. Again, housing supply elasticity matters. The regulatory index doesn't have as big of an impact on unsheltered homelessness, but the presence of an urban growth boundary does. And in both cases, the unavailable land indicator is associated with unsheltered adult homelessness. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this slide, what I'm doing is sort of asking a question using the statistical model. One of the things that we can do is say, if we took one metropolitan area and switched its conditions so that it looked like a different metropolitan area, how would that change the rate of homelessness in that area? So I picked two metros, one of which I'm very familiar with, Atlanta, which is where I'm from, and then compared that with San Francisco, which in many ways, these two are sort of diametrically, they're completely different in terms of their housing supply conditions. Atlanta has virtually no barriers to expansion, whereas San Francisco has the Bay and significant geographic barriers to expanding supply. Housing supply is much more elastic in Atlanta than it is in San Francisco. Regulations, land use regulations, are much more restrictive in San Francisco than they are in Atlanta. And many communities in the Bay Area have urban growth boundaries surrounding their jurisdictions. So in each of these cases, what does it mean if Atlanta looked like San Francisco? So asking that kind of question, we see that, again, the geographic constraints have a pretty big impact on adult homelessness. This is just the total adult homelessness rate. So if you sort of switched Atlanta so that it had the constrained supply that the Bay Area has, homelessness would rise by about 65%. If housing supply was as inelastic as it is in San Francisco, homelessness would go up by about 17%. Same for regulatory restrictiveness, the percentage increase is smaller. And the urban growth boundary effect would be associated with about a 27% increase in homelessness. Next slide, please. Okay, so just sort of pulling all of this together, and the paper sort of goes into a lot of different things in more detail, but really sort of the big takeaway from this research is that homelessness is consistently associated with more restrictive land use practices and geographic and policy-based constraints on developable land. Declines in homelessness are associated with new residential construction and more responsive housing supply elasticity. And one of the things that I did not show you in the slides or in the graphics, but I tested this conjecture of, is there a direct effect, and how does it affect the indirect effect that was previously assumed to be the sort of causal channel linking regulations to homelessness. And basically, I found that if we assume that this channel only operates as an indirect effect, we're overestimating the effect on homelessness, the effect of regulatory reform on homelessness. That by modeling as a direct effect, it's actually a much more modest effect, and that previous estimates that only look at it through the effects on rents are likely sort of overestimated estimates of the impact of reform, land use policy reform on homelessness. Next slide, please. So what does all this mean for policy? And I think there are a couple of different takeaways, but I want to sort of cast that in a subtle, there's sort of subtle interpretations, I think, of some of the findings. And the big takeaway is that land use policy reform can be a useful tool in the fight against homelessness. I mean, obviously, the geographic constraints more or less are what they are. There's not a lot we can do about, oceans and rivers and steep slopes that limit the ability to build. But land use restrictions are amenable to policy reform. And you see a lot of action being taken around the country now, in Minneapolis, in Oregon, and California, where they're revising regulations to allow more moderate densities, to allow higher densities within previously single family only zoned land. And those are the kinds of reforms that would be consistent with the findings of this research. And have a but here, though. The findings also suggest that some of the previous estimates of the magnitude of this reform, this kind of reform on homelessness, are likely overinflated because they're based purely on this indirect effect that I was talking about. Just to give an example, during the Trump administration, the Council of Economic Advisors had sort of reviewed the research on the link between land use regulations and rental price increases, and then the effect of rent on homelessness, and sort of inferred from that if the most supply constrained cities eliminated their restrictions on development, then it would be associated with about a 54% reduction in homelessness. But that is purely based on that particular channel of an effect. So this research actually shows that kind of modeling approach would lead to a smaller impact than the one suggested in this paper. And then the final sort of, for our, the work on the ground that all of you folks are doing, I think there's a case to be made for more coordination between the homeless assistance advocacy efforts, assistance programming efforts, particularly the work done in communities of care or continuums of care, and land use planning efforts that are done within local planning departments. There often is not a lot of coordination between those two efforts. I think the research suggests that there perhaps should be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Casey. I think this is really helpful for advocates on this call for a couple of reasons. One, because it continues to frame homelessness around what we know to be the cause of homelessness, which is the lack of affordable housing, but you take a different new angle on it. So I think that's really helpful. And then also, what we hear often from especially Republicans on the House Financial Services Committee and elsewhere is that all we really need to do is change zoning, and then we will have solved for the homelessness crisis. But we know that's not true, not only for the reasons that you mentioned, because there might be these indirect effects of NIMBYism that is playing into both worlds, but also because zoning by itself isn't going to build housing that's affordable to people with the very lowest income. So this is really, I think, very helpful context. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A box I'd love to get to. One is from Carrie Hill, who asked whether or not your study here or the arguments that you're making here, have you seen people or advocates use this to repeal the limitations on housing supply across the country?
It's interesting. I mean, the sort of advocacy work on this is to some extent siloed, I think. I think there's a lot of work around reforming housing supply, but it's often not done in conjunction with tenant advocacy, which I think it should be. It's often not done in conjunction with homeless advocacy. And I guess one of the things, and this is sort of maybe a broader hope of mine, is that we'll actually sort of try to bring a lot of these different efforts under one tent and show that there actually is a relationship between, the work that the folks are doing on this sort of zoning reform side and what needs to be done to ensure that tenant protections are more secure, and to ensure that homelessness is sort of not the outcome of the inability to get those things secured. And I sort of see there's a chain of policy interventions that sort of span everything from traditional housing to homeless advocacy that really need to be sort of thought of as a complementary package.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. I'm wondering, can you tell us when the data for your study was pulled from? And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the very recent rise in more criminalization bills sort of fits into your narrative about how communities that might be NIMBYism and not wanting to build more affordable housing might have like an overlap with these anti-homeless provisions. But now we're seeing criminalization efforts everywhere, it seems, and in many very different communities, not just conservative states, but in blue states as well. I'm wondering how you see that fitting into your research.
That's a great question. One of the downsides of doing any research is that you have to pick a time to do it. And then once you pick that time, something else happens. As it turns out, I was using data. This is all pre-COVID, stuff. So the data was 2015 to 2019. And at the time I started this, that was sort of the most recent, continuum of care work. Since then, there's been 2 additional years of data that could be used to sort of update this. But coming out of COVID, I think we did see a lot of the rise in criminalization efforts as a response to, people were becoming homeless. And then there was sort of a pullback on, now we want people, not to be housed on the streets. And I mean, even here in DC where I live, there's a lot of efforts along those lines. And I think it would be interesting actually to sort of do a more recent slice of this. And I think you would probably find some very different dynamics if you looked at the last 2 years in comparison to probably the period of the upswing prior to COVID, which is what I focused on.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining with us. If you happen to have time, there are other questions in the Q&A box that we weren't able to get to, but if you're able to stay on and answer those, that would be great. And look forward to your future research as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to hear from Ann Sawson, who's the Interim Executive Director from the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition. Ann, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And hello, everyone. It's nice to be on the call with you. I am relatively new to this role. I've only been in this position for about 2 months, so this is my first time on the call. And I'm going to talk just very briefly about an initiative that we've been piloting at the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition called Right to House, or WRITE to House. And this is an initiative that we have developed to create a critical mass of opinion pieces in support of affordable housing in the state of Vermont. We started this just a couple of weeks ago, so we're still learning from this initiative, and there are different pieces that we put together. The first piece is a workshop, or how to write an opinion piece workshop, and that's accompanied by an op-ed writing toolkit that we've been developing that includes pitching resources, data that's specific to our site, our state, evidence that can be used, best practices from other states. We're also creating a writing group that will provide mentoring and support for those who want to do op-eds. And then we're thinking about what other types of support that we can develop for our state. This is really in a very early phase, but I'd be happy to share materials with others from outside the state if it might be helpful, and to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Wonderful, Ann. I'm sure lots of people would love to see your resources. So maybe you can share it with our team and we can forward it to everybody who's on our call today. And it's great. Are you seeing that any particular resources are most helpful in terms of getting advocates to place op-eds?
So we've really just started this. We have 2 opinion pieces in the pipeline, and so it's going to take a little bit longer for us to know what's working and what's not working. I've been part of other groups that have done this though, so I'm hoping that some of the things that I've seen work elsewhere will also help our coalition and its members. And if anyone in other states would like to get in touch or see what we have, just send me an email. I'm fairly easy to find, and I'm happy to share what we have as we develop it.
Wonderful. And I'm wondering, are you using any particular sort of messaging with these op-eds? Who is your audience that you're trying to get at? Is it towards elected officials, or is it about bringing the public in and support?
Really both. To help writers define who their audience is for a particular piece, how they can, what the purpose of writing a piece is, how they can frame or reframe a narrative, and then think about how to construct an argument that is effective.
And who are the sort of folks that are attending the writing sessions, or who are you hoping are going to attend?
So again, we're really early in the implementation of this initiative. We've done 2 sessions, and most of the attendees were from the housing development organizations in our state, but I am hoping to grow it over time.
That's wonderful. Well, I think we should have you back on our call maybe in a couple of months so that you can give us an update about how this initiative is going. I know a lot of us are thinking about messaging and how do we get out to new audiences? How do we bring them into the fold of fighting for affordable housing resources? So I think there's a lot to be learned from this effort going forward.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to see if we have our other speaker on the line. Maybe Kim, can you let us know if Ellen Davidson is on, for the staff attorney from the Legal Aid Society?
Yeah, Ellen is not on yet, but she should be on soon.
Okay. You could just send me a text of how long you think that'll be. I appreciate that. In the meantime, while we're waiting, I think it might be helpful for us to go back to see if there are any other questions around the budget. I did see one question that I didn't get to earlier, so I will answer it now. But if you have other questions about what's happening on Capitol Hill, feel free to enter that into the Q&A box. One of the questions was about how do we improve the Section 8 program. So I want to use that to talk a little bit about what we're hearing about what might be possible in terms of moving legislation forward this year. So I think it's pretty clear that when you have a divided Congress, like we do now, where the House is controlled by Republicans and the Senate is controlled by Democrats, we have a looming 2024 presidential election that's on the horizon. It's very unlikely that we're going to see major legislation on housing this year, but that doesn't mean that we can't see progress on either smaller bipartisan issues or even to build momentum around our long-term goals so that we're poised in the future to be able to move it forward. So I'll give you an example of what I think might be possible this year. We've had some really helpful meetings with Ranking Member Tim Scott's office, who is the lead Republican, new incoming lead Republican for the Senate Banking Committee. We've heard a little bit of about what Representative and Chairman Patrick McHenry is interested in doing in the House Financial Services Committee. I think it's going to be difficult to imagine lots of legislation moving forward, but I do think that there's still a possibility here on some bipartisan legislation to make some gains. One bill that was mentioned earlier is the Choice and Affordable Housing Act. That's a bill, like I mentioned, that would streamline the Section 8 program, especially streamlining the inspections process. It would create a landlord incentive fund so that public housing agencies can better recruit landlords, especially if they're in low poverty areas. That's a bill that has bipartisan support in the House and Senate and is something that could move forward. We also want to see some progress on other bipartisan legislation that we think has some opportunities here. One is the Eviction Crisis Act, which would create a permanent emergency rental assistance program. Again, this is a bill that has bipartisan support. It was introduced last year from Senator Portman and Senator Bennett. Senator Portman, our lead Republican, has since retired. And so the new Republican lead is going to be Senator Young from Indiana, sort of reclaiming or continuing to claim his championship as the best, most fierce advocate among Republicans for housing issues. And so we're hoping to see that bill introduced soon, and could see and would push for, and hopefully we can see hearings on the bill and maybe even a vote out of the Senate Banking Committee this year. Finally, the other thing I want to mention is the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. Again, a bipartisan bill from Senator Young and also Senator Van Hollen from Maryland. It's a bill that would create 500,000 new housing vouchers for families with young children under the age of 6. And it would pair that housing assistance with mobility counseling, mobility services, so that households could move to communities of their choice, including having greater access to communities that might have good performing schools or access to jobs and transit and healthcare and other amenities. So that's just a couple examples of some bills that we think could make progress this year, even though it's going to be a very difficult climate ahead. And I'm just going to see if we have any update on where Ellen might be. I'm going to see if there's any questions in the Q&A chat box. Yeah, so there's a question, good question from an anonymous asker about which Republicans are proposing to eliminate the Section 8 program. So what's interesting here is that the reports of that are largely pointing to conservative think tanks, not members of Congress themselves, although many members of Congress have said that they're looking at that overall budget proposal from that third-party group. So it's a little hard to identify exactly which offices are calling for those major cuts. Again, that was a 43% cut to HUD programs and the elimination of the Section 8 program. But it's good to know, for you guys to know, that it's out there in the ether, it's in the conversation about the scope of cuts that Republicans should be pushing for. I think my sense is that next month in April, we'll see from Republicans what their proposal looks like in more detail. So we'll have a sense of what a worst case scenario could be in terms of cuts to housing. Advocates have several months ahead of us to have an impact on these conversations around budget cuts. It's really important that you don't just stick to your Democratic members of Congress. We need to be talking to every member of Congress about what such deep spending cuts would mean to HUD programs and what it would mean for your community, for people who are in need of housing assistance. And we need to make the case also proactively about why we need at the highest level of funding that's possible this year. We're not going to be satisfied if we just hold on to what we have. We need to make sure that we're moving the ball forward, expanding rental assistance, for example, to more households that are in need, not just preventing cuts from being made. I'm looking here to see another question in the Q&A box. Not sure what that question is asking about, so I'm going to move on to the chat box to see if there's any other questions. Jay Summerlot is pointing out that the elimination of the Housing Choice Voucher Program was included in the list of priorities for the House Freedom Caucus. So I thank Jay for lifting that up. I see also that Ellen has joined us. And so we will turn to Ellen. Thanks for joining. Ellen is the staff attorney with the Legal Aid Society, and we're going to turn to her for a field update. Thank you, Ellen.
Yes, thanks for having me. Hi, I'm Ellen Davidson, and as I said, I'm a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society, and I was asked to come and talk about some recent court cases that we have been participating in with recent decisions from the Second Circuit. And just to give a little bit of background, in New York State, we have had some version of rent control since we've actually had some form of rent control since the 50s. But we've had a specific law that was passed in 1974, which covers in New York City about 2.5 million tenants. And it's our rent stabilization law. And it's an incredibly important protection that tenants have in New York, because they have rights to renewal leases and they have limitations on rent increases. And it's the largest form of affordable housing we actually have in New York City. The law's been around forever. For years and years, we had loopholes put into the law by when the landlords got changes to the law that were detrimental to tenants. Finally, after electoral changes in New York State in 2019, we had a law called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act was passed, which closed the loopholes and did other really good things that helped tenants in New York State. And almost as soon as we passed the law, which was a fairly long law, the real estate industry announced that they were going to sue to overturn it. And 3 weeks later, we got the first complaint seeking to overturn our rent laws. I don't know how many people on this call are lawyers. It is not easy to put together a 90-page complaint on a new law in 3 weeks. And when we started to look at the complaint, we realized that they were actually not suing to overturn our new law and our amendments, but what they were trying to do was to overturn the 1974 law, and that they had actually not gotten the idea to bring this case based on the amendments we got passed. But 18 months before the amendments were passed, the real estate industry had hired attorneys thinking that because there are new people on the Supreme Court, but that maybe they could end rent regulation forever, based on not changes in the law, but changes in court personnel. And so that case was called Chip versus New York City. And after that, 4 additional cases were filed, and they range whether they're attacking the original 1974 law or they're attacking the amendments. And all cases, the Supreme Court precedent when it comes to rent stabilization, rent control schemes is really clear. It says that the legislature can pass such laws. And that's, there have been many attempts to overturn New York City's laws, and each time it's been turned back because of these very strong decisions by the Supreme Court. So each one of these cases got dismissed by the lower courts almost immediately. And, we had judges that ranged. We had a judge appointed by Trump. We had a judge appointed by Bush. We had a judge appointed by Clinton. And each decision was pretty much the same thing. They said, this is what the law is. You're allowed to do these types of laws. And then all the cases have been appealed to the Second Circuit. And finally, in January, we received the first 2 decisions in the case called Chip versus New York City and 74 Pinehurst. And the decisions were wonderful. In previous times when I think it was clear to the judges on the Second Circuit that the entire purpose of this lawsuit is to get to the Supreme Court. And unlike previous times when the laws have been challenged, where you get a summary decision, it's not very long, you don't know who authored it. This time they took the opportunity to really talk about why the rent laws are needed, and why they protect low-income tenants, why it is legitimate for a state legislature to decide that neighborhood stability is important for the communities they represent. And they found every single one of the landlords' arguments to be meritless. We ended up having a decision that was written by a judge who was appointed by George W. Bush. So we're not talking about, a judge that is out of step with the rest of the circuit. It's a great decision as we head into the landlord's next step, which is they are seeking to they're asking the Supreme Court to take the case. I think we're probably in the best possible position to be in with these very strong decisions behind us as we go into the next process. I guess the other thing I'd like to say is that while I'm talking about rent stabilization, which I know is not in a lot of places, what the landlords are actually complaining about, which is the tenant's right to a renewal lease and having laws that limit rent increases in any way, shape, or form. Those are sort of the basis for the good cause laws that we see increasingly in other parts of the country, in Oregon and Washington and California. DC, New Jersey has a form of good cause law. And so, if the Supreme Court were to take the case and do the most harm with these laws, it could end up with tenants not being able to pass any laws that protect them. And it would be a fairly big disaster, not only in New York City, but all across the country. That being said, I remain hopeful that the Supreme Court will decide not to take the case. Unlike some of the other decisions that I'm sure people have followed over the last couple of years, where the Supreme Court has overturned precedent, older cases, the case that is relied on by the Second Circuit is a Supreme Court case from 1992, and it was decided 9-0. So it wasn't seen as a controversial case. It was a decision signed on with the opinion was signed on to by Thomas and Scalia. Since that time, we haven't seen any of the justices say that they want to revisit this case. So I think that the Supreme Court justices have a lot of things that they want to change and overturn. And I'm not sure that our cases are the ones they're looking to change. So as I said, I remain hopeful. And then the other thing I would say is that the parties in the case are either individual landlords or landlord groups who sued the city and the state. And we at Legal Aid, with our partners at Legal Services NYC and a firm called Celandine and Gay, we intervened into the case on behalf of tenant groups on the side of the government. So we are actually parties in the case, and we did that because the landlords' complaints, told the story of the landlords and tried to explain why they thought landlords should have these laws overturned with as many sympathetic facts as possible. And the government, of course, has to defend the government and the government's right to make laws. But we thought it was really important that tenants have the opportunity to tell their stories as part of this case. And we did that. Oh, and then I guess the last thing I'd say, and in case people have questions, is that as part of the effort in the Second Circuit, both sides had people submit what they call amicus briefs, which are friend of the court briefs. And one of the things I think that was very helpful in our side of the case was, unlike the landlords who basically had right-wing think tanks write some form of the same brief like 12 times, we tried to think very carefully about who we wanted to weigh in. And so we had two of the biggest municipal unions in New York come in and talk about what it meant to their members. And we had, other tenant groups who talked about the history of the rent laws in great detail. And we had some constitutional scholars weigh in, and we had public health practitioners, public health academics weigh in, and housing policy analysts. And the other thing we had was national groups who had interest in tenants' rights. So the National Low Income Housing Coalition joined one of these amicus briefs, and every single person who worked on any of the briefs, their work was so appreciated. The court cited to a number of those briefs, and I don't think we would have been as successful without the help of our community. And so I think that's pretty much what I wanted to present on.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It's deeply scary to hear about the possibility of going to the Supreme Court on this. I'm wondering if you could tell us what would be the timeline for when the Supreme Court might make that decision? When would you guys know if it was in fact being taken up by the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so the case was decided in January. The landlords have 90 days before they have to submit their petition seeking certiorari, their cert petition. And so that would take us into January. That would take us to, I think, April. We'll have an opportunity, and the state and the city will have their opportunity to put in their briefs. I suspect that we won't know until next year, because at a certain point they stop taking cases for. I think we'll find out whether they take it sometime next year.
Okay, that's good to know. And yeah, I don't know if you said this, but on what basis are the landlord groups challenging the law? Are they making a constitutional argument? And if so, on what grounds?
Yeah, so they have a range of arguments. The basic arguments are that that the rent laws are a physical taking, that it is a regulatory taking, that it violates due process because the purpose of the laws is not a rational purpose for the legislature to be acting on. And then there's a bunch of like smaller arguments that I don't think even the landlords think are actually important, including like a contracts clause claim. And one landlord tried to argue that the laws were a violation of the Fair Housing Act because there was a article from the Wall Street Journal who tried to claim with no evidence that the laws helped white people more than it helped people of color, which is both factually untrue and shouldn't be enough to overturn, 50-year-old law.
Thank you for that, Ellen. And so that Second Circuit court case, which is the most recent case that was decided, can you talk about what impact that has on federal courts that are within that jurisdiction? What does that mean for those states and for advocates that might be doing work in those states to enact renter protections?
Yeah, it's Second Circuit. That's New York, Connecticut, maybe Puerto Rico is the third state. Vermont, sorry, New York, Connecticut, Vermont. So our Second Circuit has made it very clear that they think it is settled precedent that you can pass laws that protect tenants, that it is a legitimate purpose for the legislature to choose to pass laws that promote neighborhood stability. I know that there are advocates that are defending tenant protection laws that were passed even outside of the Second Circuit and that are now using these cases because even if you're outside of the circuit, when you get a decision that is as well reasoned as our decision is, it tends to be something that courts pay attention to. It was I don't think we could have expected a better reasoned, better decision than the one we got. And I think it will be useful for advocates who are defending landlords claiming that tenant protection laws are unconstitutional, even outside of the Second Circuit.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm sure we'll see more challenges to renter protections, especially because in the last couple of years, we've seen a huge number of jurisdictions pass new renter protections coming out of the pandemic. I know that we tracked at least 160 different jurisdictions. So it would be unsurprising to see landlord groups sort of respond to that by trying to challenge these court cases. So that's incredibly helpful. We have a question from Rachel about whether or not you can share the cases that you mentioned that were dismissed to overturn laws. If you could just share that with us maybe afterwards. And we'll.
You mean the CHIP case, the Pinehurst case? I think I sent them to you with the sites. Were they not in the chat? I thought I saw the
I did
Pinehurst.
see that in the chat. And we'll make sure we will make sure we pull those out for the email that goes to everybody afterwards so that you have.
Yeah, I sent them out with, if you look at the CHIP case and the Pinehurst case, which are in the chat, I put in also the, the link to the Second Circuit, so you can just click on that and get to the Second Circuit and see the case.
Perfect. Thank you, Ellen. I also see a question from Jordan who's asking, what is the difference for this case? Is there a difference between rent stabilization and rent control that's at hand?
No, I mean, so no, the answer is no. So in New York, we have two systems. One is an older system called rent control. We have very few units. Like, I think it's less than 20,000 out of the 2 million rental units in New York City. There's less than 20,000 rent control left. But we have 1 million units of rent stabilization. And I think that if you had rent control, you would recognize our laws. We just call them different words, but it's really a rent control system.
Okay, perfect. And where can people follow up to get more information about the latest on what, this interaction between you guys and the landlord groups in the court?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, you can always reach out to me. This type of stuff does get reported. I'm sure that the next time something comes, I imagine you guys would invite me to talk about it.
We certainly will. It's a good reminder to us that when you hear of any updates from the legal cases, if you could let us know, and we'll definitely have you on to share more updates with folks. I'm sure many people are like me. This causes a great concern about what the possible impact would be if the Supreme Court did take this up. So we're so glad that you're on the front lines pushing back on this.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly important that we maintain these laws.
Thank you so much for joining, Ellen. And with that, I'm going to wrap up today's call. Again, a reminder for folks to register to attend our forum, which is starting next week. We are at capacity for registrations, but you are able to attend virtually if you like. And if you haven't already, you should sign up to participate in our Hill Day advocacy work next Thursday. Advocates across the country are going to be coming together to meet with their members of Congress to talk about the budget threats that I mentioned earlier on the call and the need for sustained large-scale investments in affordable housing to help those who have the very lowest incomes and who are the most marginalized. And with that, I'm going to end today's call, and thank you everybody for being here today.